I never thought a simple letter could tear my life apart, but the moment he read it, everything I thought I knew about my family shattered. What followed wasn't just a fight to save my marriage, it was a battle for my very place in their lives. It all began about 6 months ago when Laura first met Pete at a professional networking event organized by a prominent local marketing firm. Laura, a driven project manager working for a real estate company, couldn't help but be drawn to Pete's effortless charisma and sharp sense of humor. Their conversation that night felt surprisingly natural, flowing in a way that neither of them had anticipated. By the end of the evening, they exchanged phone numbers under the pretense of continuing their discussion on industry trends. Initially, their messages were innocent, quick exchanges about work, mutual interests, and light-hearted jokes about the monotony of corporate life. However, as the days turned into weeks, the nature of their conversations began to shift. The messages became more personal, more revealing. Pete opened up about feeling stuck in a lifeless marriage, while Laura confided in him about the emptiness she often felt at home. Both found themselves seeking solace in each other's words, and before long, the line between a professional friendship and emotional intimacy started to blur. At home, Laura's life seemed outwardly perfect, stable and orderly. David, her husband, was a kind-hearted and dependable man, always preoccupied with keeping the household running smoothly and taking care of their 3 young children. Their marriage, once filled with passion and spontaneity, had quietly settled into a routine of predictability. Though she appreciated David's steady presence, Laura couldn't help but feel that something vital was missing, a spark, a sense of excitement. The guilt she felt for harboring these thoughts was overshadowed by the exhilaration she experienced whenever she spoke with Pete. Pete, a charismatic sales executive known for his magnetic personality, often regaled Laura with stories of his youth, tales of his carefree days exploring foreign countries and living spontaneously. These vivid accounts stirred something deep within Laura, sparking dreams of a more adventurous life far from the familiarity of suburban life. Eventually, Pete suggested something daring, a getaway to Bali. He described the island as enchanting and life-changing, painting such a vivid picture that Laura found herself intrigued despite her initial reluctance. She knew it was risky, but the idea of breaking free from her ordinary world proved too tempting to resist. As their plan began to take shape, Laura carefully constructed a cover story to ensure her family wouldn't suspect a thing. She told David she had to attend an important out-of-state training conference for work and arranged for their children to stay with her in-laws during her absence. The intricate planning added a layer of excitement to the trip, making it feel even more like a thrilling, forbidden adventure. The night before they were scheduled to leave, Laura sat alone in her home office, staring at a draft of a letter she had written to David. In it, she tried to articulate her feelings, her love for him and their family, but also her unspoken desire for self-discovery and independence. With hesitation, she sealed the letter in an envelope, placing it gently beneath his pillow. What she didn't realize was that this one seemingly small gesture would set off a series of events she could never have foreseen, events that would ultimately change the course of their lives forever. Laura and Pete sat together in the crowded airport lounge, eagerly awaiting their flight to Bali. After weeks of careful planning and growing anticipation, their much-anticipated escape was finally happening. Exhausted from a late night spent packing, Laura leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes, her fingers loosely intertwined with Pete's. The promise of 2 weeks filled with luxury, indulgence, and an escape from reality felt like exactly what she needed. Their moment of calm was interrupted by the chime of Pete's phone. He glanced at the screen, and after a moment's pause, casually reminded Laura, "Don't forget to switch your phone to airplane mode." "I didn't bring it," she replied, shrugging as if it were no big deal. Pete's relaxed demeanor changed abruptly. His face grew tense as he stared at the message on his screen. Alarmed by his sudden shift in expression, Laura sat up straight. "What's wrong?" she asked, concerned. Instead of answering right away, Pete turned the phone toward her. On the screen was a cryptic message that read, "Peter, touch that woman and you'll regret it for the rest of your life." Laura's eyes widened as she read it. "Pete, what is this?" You should have warned me, she said, exasperated. Who sent this? I don't know, he muttered, shaking his head. But whoever it is, they seem serious. As the tension settled between them, the boarding call for their flight echoed through the lounge speakers. Deciding it was better to let the matter rest for now, they gathered their things and made their way onto the plane. Once they reached cruising altitude, Laura pulled out her laptop, a thoughtful expression on her face. She opened a document she had been working on for days and handed it to Pete. I've been thinking this through, she began. This is a letter I wrote for David. He'll find it tonight. It gives him 2 weeks to think about what he wants, and depending on his decision, well, this trip could either mark the beginning of something new for us, or it could mean returning to the life I had. Pete accepted the laptop, his brow furrowed in curiosity as he began reading the letter. Dear David. For 25 years, I have loved you deeply. Our life together and the family we built mean the world to me. But I feel like I'm at a crossroads. There's something missing, something I need to figure out for myself. Please use these 2 weeks to reflect. Whatever decision you make, I promise to respect it, with the same care and love you've always shown me. Yours always. Laura. Pete finished reading, letting out a low whistle. Wow. Laura smiled slightly. Good, isn't it? I borrowed some phrasing from an online story I read a while ago. Pete raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. An erotic fiction site, huh? And you're calling this whole thing an investment in your future? Why? It's simple, Laura replied calmly. I'm asking my husband for permission to step outside our marriage. If he agrees, this trip won't just be an escape, it'll be the start of something new. Pete leaned back in his seat, clearly impressed by her boldness but also wary of the situation. Well, you certainly have a way of handling things. As the conversation drifted into lighter topics, Pete suddenly remembered something odd. Speaking of strange things. I saw something weird back at the terminal. There was this guy who kept staring at me. When I looked at him, he made this weird throat-slashing gesture. Freaked me out. Laura's eyebrows knitted together in concern. What did he look like? Pete thought for a moment before answering. Tall, over 6 feet, dark hair, goatee. Seemed like an ordinary guy, nothing special. A flicker of unease crossed Laura's face. She opened her laptop again and navigated to a folder of photos, quickly pulling up an image. In the photo, she stood beside a man in front of a modest beach house. Her voice trembled slightly as she turned the screen toward Pete. Is this the guy you saw? Pete leaned in, squinting at the image. After a moment, he gave a hesitant nod. Yeah, that's him. Who is he? Laura didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stared at the screen, her heart pounding as a sense of foreboding crept over her. Whatever this trip was meant to be, it was clear now, it wouldn't be as simple as an idyllic getaway. For over 15 years, Laura's husband, David, had devoted himself to designing and building their home from the ground up. Every inch of the house reflected his meticulous attention to detail and his passion for unique, handcrafted touches. Each room featured a different theme, nautical murals adorned the walls of the living room, the bathrooms boasted sleek business motifs, and the study had an innovative design that incorporated a small creek running directly beneath the floor. His vision was so remarkable that it had even earned architectural awards. As Laura recounted these details with pride, Pete listened politely, nodding along, though his mind was elsewhere. An uneasy feeling gnawed at him, a sense that someone, perhaps Laura's husband, might already be on to them. The excitement of their forbidden getaway was beginning to wear thin under the weight of suspicion. Still, they pressed forward, determined to enjoy their escape. Friday evening passed quietly. Pete and Laura shared a meal and tried to relax, but Pete couldn't shake his growing apprehension. On Saturday morning, Laura convinced David to help her with her bags and leave quickly, urging him to skip his usual routine of lingering around. His unusual compliance, which initially gave her a sense of relief, began to feel suspicious in hindsight. Had he picked up on something despite her elaborate efforts to keep things under wraps? Laura tried to brush away her doubts, clinging to the hope that her husband was entirely in the dark. After all, David didn't know her coworkers, and no one at her office knew her real plans for the weekend. Yet, as the morning wore on and they settled into their hotel, Laura's nervousness began to grow. Their fragile peace was interrupted when Sarah, Laura's oldest daughter, finally returned Pete's call. She confirmed she had followed her mother's instructions but added something unsettling. Dad took Daniel and Larry to the family cabin for the weekend, she explained. He called earlier, said he needed some time to think. He sounded off. Hearing this, Laura froze. The cabin was an isolated property deep in the woods, far from any form of modern communication. It was a place David often went when he needed clarity or a break from everything. But this time, he hadn't mentioned it to her at all. The realization left her rattled. "Thanks for letting me know, Sarah," Laura said, her voice steadier than she felt. She hung up and exchanged a troubled glance with Pete. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, David was piecing things together in a way Laura had never anticipated. That morning, plagued by a gnawing suspicion he couldn't shake, he had gone through her purse and found her passport. To his shock, it contained an Indonesian visa stamped just 3 weeks earlier. He immediately remembered spotting a Bali travel brochure in the house the previous month, a detail he had dismissed at the time. But now, it painted a different picture. Bali's in Indonesia, he told his 2 sons, Daniel and Larry, who sat wide-eyed as he spoke. "Not out of state, like your mom said." He paused, looking at them carefully before adding, "She lied about where she was going." The boys listened in silence, unsure of how to respond. David took a deep breath, trying to steady his voice. "I don't know what's going on, but I sent a message. I warned them there would be serious consequences if they," he stopped himself, struggling to find the right words. "If they cross a line." Sarah, who had just arrived at the cabin, tilted her head in confusion. "Dad, Mom left her phone at home," she said gently. "She wouldn't have gotten your message." David's expression darkened as realization hit him. He frowned deeply, his tone growing sharper as he asked, "What number did she give you to contact her?" Sarah pulled up Laura's instructions on her phone, reading aloud the first 6 digits of the contact number her mother had provided. Dave's brow furrowed as he listened, but before he could say anything, Larry spoke up, his voice steady and firm. "Dad, don't let this change how you feel about her," Sarah said cautiously, trying to ease the tension. "No, Dad," Larry interrupted, his tone resolute. "The moment she lied to all of us, she removed herself from this family." Dave studied his son's determined expression. Larry's words, though harsh, carried the weight of truth. He realized how deeply his children had been affected by Laura's deception. For years, he had tried to shield them from the complexities of adult issues, but now, they were being forced to confront the harsh realities of betrayal and broken trust. Meanwhile, back at the hotel, Laura surprised Pete by asking for a private room on another floor. She booked it for 2 nights, ensuring she could extend her stay if necessary, without any disruptions. Pete raised an eyebrow, clearly confused by the sudden change in plans. "Why the separate room?" he asked, sounding disappointed. "He knows nothing, but we're not taking any chances." "We're not sleeping together," Laura answered briskly, waving off his objections before he could respond. Pete frowned. "You think he's onto us?" "If I were your husband, I'd probably hire a private investigator." Seeing the realization dawn on his face, Laura leaned in and said quietly, "Exactly. Now you understand. Stay away from my room, don't touch me, and if anything happens, notify me immediately." Pete nodded reluctantly, glancing around the hotel lobby as though searching for hidden cameras. He muttered something under his breath about spending the night alone, likely planning to call an escort. Laura didn't care, Her anxiety was reaching a boiling point. Alone in her room, she paced back and forth, racked with guilt and fear. She began frantically researching divorce laws online and sent a desperate email to the family lawyer, asking for advice. Though the lawyer admitted that divorce wasn't his area of expertise, he confirmed many of her fears about the financial risks and potential custody battles that could ensue. By Friday morning, convinced that David was already aware of her affair, Laura took swift action to protect her interests. She instructed her lawyer to freeze key assets and quickly transferred ownership of their last vacant property into a trust shared with Sarah. If things fell apart, she wanted to ensure her children would be financially secure. But the real bombshell came later that day. Laura was scrolling through social media when she saw a post on Larry's Facebook account. It was a public announcement, stating that his parents were divorcing. Stunned, Laura let out a scream. "What is Dave doing?" she muttered bitterly, her hands trembling. To her, divorce wasn't something to be broadcast on social media. It was supposed to involve private discussions, careful deliberations, and mutual respect. Yet here was Dave, seemingly turning the children against her and making unilateral decisions. She felt a bitter pang of resentment. Dave had always supported her career, willingly stepping into the role of stay-at-home dad so she could become the family's primary breadwinner. He had never complained, never demanded more, yet now he was preparing to dismantle everything they had built together. Panicked, Laura prayed for a sign, a way to stop this spiral before it was too late. She wrote a vague, hastily composed letter to Dave, asking Sarah to deliver it. The letter was an emotional plea, aimed at delaying any irreversible decisions. She begged for time, urging Dave not to act rashly. She also scheduled an appointment with a marriage counselor, hoping it might offer them a path toward reconciliation. Meanwhile, back home, Sarah overheard Dave speaking with their neighbor, John Smith, who happened to be a lawyer. "So, besides informing Pete's wife, what else have you done?" John asked. "Nothing yet," Dave replied, sighing heavily. "I'm waiting to hear what Laura has to say before deciding on divorce." Sarah, unable to stay silent, interjected sharply. "Dad, stop being naive. Mom's lawyer is already taking steps to protect her interests. You need to be proactive." Dave looked at his daughter, torn between anger and sorrow. He hadn't wanted to involve the children in this mess, but it seemed unavoidable now. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. It was Sarah, calling from Laura's phone to deliver her mother's message. "Dad, Mom wants you to hear her out. She says she'll take a lie detector test when she gets back and answer any questions you have. She's asking for a chance to explain everything before you do anything drastic. She's worried about what a divorce will do to us, the kids, the house, the finances. She's begging you to reconsider." Dave closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the situation settle heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just about him and Laura anymore. It was about their children, their home, and the life they had built over the years. As much as he wanted to believe things could still be fixed, the trust that had once held their family together was hanging by a thread. "When I return. Your loving wife, Laura." Dave read the closing line of her letter once more, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. The words that once might have sounded heartfelt now felt hollow and manipulative. After reading the letter, Dave sat down heavily, trying to process everything. His neighbor, John, who had been listening quietly, finally broke the silence. "Look, Dave, I'm not trying to make things worse, but you need to protect yourself. She's already taken steps, you can't just sit back and do nothing." Unbeknownst to Dave, the reason Laura's lawyer was acting so swiftly wasn't due to her interference but rather the firm's standard protocol for high-stakes divorce cases. Still, Dave couldn't shake the feeling that Laura had outmaneuvered him, and now he was scrambling to catch up. Returning to the room after stepping outside for some air, Dave sighed deeply. "Okay, John, I believe you. What should I do?" John didn't hesitate. "First, Block access to all financial accounts she doesn't control outright, and restrict any joint spending. Cancel shared credit cards immediately. You need to secure your assets before things get messy. Dave paused, conflicted. I still want to believe she loves me, you know. But, the second half of her letter, it doesn't match that. It's like she's already moving on. Sarah, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, finally spoke up. Dad, are you sure you're ready for this? I mean, do you think there's even a chance she wants to fix things? Dave didn't answer right away. He was still reeling from the 2 emails he had received earlier that day. The first, from Pete's wife, Riley, was filled with accusations, claiming that Laura's actions had destroyed her family and put their children's future at risk. The second email, from his own daughter Danielle, included a copy of one of Laura's letters to Pete, accompanied by a simple, devastating question: why did you lie to us? Laura, meanwhile, was struggling to understand how her supposedly foolproof plan had unraveled so quickly. She had assumed David wouldn't take any drastic action and believed her infidelity would remain undiscovered. But things had spiraled out of control faster than she ever imagined. 2 particular emails deepened her growing sense of dread, the furious one from Riley and the heartbreaking one from Danielle. Each message drove home the painful reality that she was no longer in control of the narrative. Back in the room, Dave tried to stay composed as he addressed his children. This is hard on all of us. But if your mother is willing to admit her mistakes and show genuine remorse, I think we should give her a chance. If she doesn't, we'll reassess the situation. Daniel, his voice quiet but resolute, added, I hope she can learn, Dad. But if she doesn't, we can't let her keep hurting us. Larry, however, was less forgiving. I don't care what happens to her. I just want to stay with you. Dave gave his youngest son a faint, sad smile. I understand, Larry. And I appreciate how honest you're being. As the discussion continued, Dave shared his thoughts. I think your mom lost her way after her promotion. It put a lot of pressure on her, but that doesn't excuse what she's done. We'll give her a chance to explain herself. If she can't, or if she refuses to change, then we'll have to move forward without her. Meanwhile, Laura's mind was racing as she speculated about what Dave's questions might be during the polygraph test she had agreed to take. If the questions focused solely on whether she had been physically unfaithful with Pete or anyone else, she felt confident she could handle it. But the idea of answering questions about her intentions, her emotional loyalty, or her overall behavior as a wife filled her with unease. Memories of her flirtations and emotional entanglements with both Pete and an old flame, Michael, resurfaced, leaving her increasingly anxious. Realizing that overthinking could raise her stress levels and affect her ability to remain calm during the test, Laura resolved to stay composed. She didn't tell anyone when she landed, opting to take a cab directly to her polygraph appointment. She wanted to avoid unnecessary interactions until she had a clearer plan in place. As she approached her house later that evening, she noticed something odd. Across the street, a car was parked with its headlights off. Inside were Dave and her sons, Daniel and Larry, watching quietly. They exchanged glances, relieved that they had prepared for this moment the night before. Dave, unwilling to risk a confrontation in front of the children, started the engine and drove away, heading toward the motel where they had booked a room. Their phones remained off to avoid any further contact from Laura, who didn't reach out to them until late Monday evening. Her silence over the weekend shattered any hope Dave had that she might have used the time for genuine reflection. When they finally met at the counselor's office, Dave gave Laura the opportunity to speak first. Taking a deep breath, Laura began recounting their marriage, insisting, I was a faithful wife and mother for years. Everything I did was for this family, but somewhere along the line, I lost sight of what mattered. Dave sat silently, his expression unreadable, as he listened to her version of events. He had heard enough excuses over the past few days and wasn't interested in hearing more unless it came with genuine accountability. I made a terrible mistake, Laura admitted, her voice trembling with a mix of guilt and shame. "I lied to my family, and I went on a date with another man. There was no physical affair, but the intent was there. I deeply regret my actions and want to move forward with my marriage." Her eyes darted nervously toward Dave, searching for any sign of softness in his expression, but his face remained impassive. The counselor nodded, then turned to Dave. "How do you feel about Laura's statement?" Dave responded plainly, his tone steady but firm. "My children's main grievance isn't just the date, it's the lies. She didn't just betray me, she used her so-called vacation as a way to abandon us, deliberately cutting off contact by leaving her phone behind. They feel hurt, ignored, and lied to, and that trust is hard to rebuild." Laura felt a flicker of irritation rise within her. She knew she had made mistakes, but hearing it laid out so bluntly stirred her frustration. When the session ended, Dave left without a word. Instead of chasing after him to apologize, Laura vented her feelings to the counselor. By the time she finished, Dave was long gone. Sensing Laura's distress, the counselor offered to mediate another session and even reached out to Dave, offering him a solo appointment to air his grievances in private. Despite the counselor's efforts, the family meeting scheduled for Wednesday didn't fare any better. Hoping to ease the tension, Laura invited everyone to dinner beforehand, but Sarah bluntly declined, adding a pointed jab, "You can't cook, Mom." Stung but determined, Laura suggested they simply arrive at 7:30 p.m. for the meeting instead. When the family finally gathered, the atmosphere was tense. Sarah remained guarded, Larry avoided eye contact, and Daniel sat quietly, watching everything unfold. At one point, Laura tried to explain herself, but Sarah retorted sharply, cutting her off. Laura flushed, unsure if her reaction was driven by anger or embarrassment. It hit her then, her children weren't going to offer her sympathy. Dave still held their trust, and she was the outsider in her own family. Frustrated, Laura turned to Dave and said sharply, "David, to the kitchen. Now." Once behind the closed door, her voice dropped to a hiss. "Does it really have to come to this, David? Me begging for forgiveness while you stand there smugly, watching me break?" Dave sighed, his expression tinged with sadness. "It doesn't have to be this way. But if you refuse to take responsibility for what you've done and insist on blaming everyone else, what choice do we have? If you'd simply do what's right, none of this would be inevitable." Laura clenched her jaw, unwilling to give in. The tension between them hung thick in the air, neither willing to back down. Meanwhile, news of their marital issues had spread beyond their immediate circle. By the time their divorce proceedings began, reporters had caught wind of the case. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Laura's attorney began presenting their case, outlining property ownership and Laura's earning power. When it was Dave's turn to speak, the room fell silent, all eyes fixed on him. Dave stood, his tone calm and deliberate. "Laura, I built our family home with my own hands. Is that correct?" "Yes," Laura admitted quietly. "And I earned the majority of the money for our household while you returned to work just 2 months after each of our children was born. Is that true?" Laura opened her mouth, but Dave didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he pulled out a copy of the letter Laura had written before her trip and began reading it aloud. Each word resonated in the silent courtroom, the weight of her intentions clear. Reporters scribbled notes furiously as Laura's furious silence said more than any denial could have. When he finished reading, Dave turned to Laura once more, his gaze steady. "Upon returning from your trip, did you apologize to me or our children for your lies and immoral intentions?" The room fell silent again, the question hanging heavily in the air. Laura remained silent, her expression steely. She couldn't bring herself to answer. Dave turned to the judge and concluded, "Your Honor, trust in a marriage is built on honesty." Laura's actions not only shattered that trust but showed a lack of remorse. "I ask the court to consider that as we move forward." With that, Dave handed copies of Laura's incriminating letter to the reporters gathered at the back of the courtroom before walking out without a backward glance. His departure left an eerie silence in the room. Even Laura's lawyer, who had fought hard to paint her in a sympathetic light, seemed subdued by Dave's calm yet devastating remarks. After the hearing, Laura's lawyer tried to reassure her, offering congratulations on what appeared to be a minor victory in court. But to Laura, it felt hollow. Dave's words had struck a nerve, and instead of relief, she felt only bitterness and regret. The realization hit her hard: this wasn't just about winning or losing a case. It was about the trust she had destroyed and the family she risked losing forever. Laura's instinct to fight back kicked in with full force. Meanwhile, Dave, guided by advice from Sarah and emboldened by his children's unwavering support, escalated his efforts. He filed a formal complaint with the federal court president, alleging judicial bias in the handling of their case. That weekend, Dave packed up their belongings and moved into a rental home with the children. He spent his time fixing up the place, determined to create a stable environment for them despite the chaos of the ongoing legal battle. Laura, on the other hand, struggled to understand why Dave was so deeply offended. She rationalized her actions, telling herself, and anyone who would listen, that there had been no physical affair. There was no sex, she admitted bitterly to the counselor, and that wasn't even by my choice. She couldn't grasp why Dave cared so much about her intent when, in her mind, nothing tangible had happened. The counselor, however, gently warned her that reconciliation was unlikely unless she could acknowledge the deeper betrayal, her dishonesty and emotional infidelity. The next day, Dave attended a brief solo session with the counselor. Frustrated by what he perceived as bias, he demanded either a referral to someone impartial or a formal declaration that the marriage was irreparable. He wasn't interested in endless therapy sessions, he wanted a clear path forward. Meanwhile, Laura's grasp on the situation continued to unravel. She stormed out of her next session in a fit of rage, unaware that Daniel had secretly placed a recording device in her purse before she arrived. Later that evening, Dave calmly erased the recording, confident that justice would catch up with the counselor soon enough. He was right. 3 days later, the counselor was dismissed amid allegations of misconduct. On Saturday, the situation took a dramatic turn when Children's Services arrived to enforce a temporary custody ruling. However, Danielle and Larry refused to leave with the officers without being forcibly removed. As the officers explained the court's decision, Sarah calmly stepped in and asserted her legal authority, revealing that she had taken control of the family trusts. Realizing how thoroughly Sarah had outmaneuvered her, Laura seethed with anger. She cursed her arrogance for assuming her children would automatically side with her. Consumed by frustration and self-pity, Laura sat down and penned a desperate letter to her children, asking, "Do you really hate me that much?" Dave's reply was simple but cutting, "We don't hate you. But you knew I would always protect our family, even from you." On Monday morning, Laura received Dave's divorce filing at work. At first glance, the agreement seemed generous, granting her full ownership of jointly acquired property. However, as she read further, she realized it wasn't the victory she had hoped for. The agreement locked her out of future claims and financial support, ensuring Dave's independence. Worse, it placed final arbitration under the same family court judge notorious for bias against female plaintiffs. Confident in her chances, Laura planned to leave Dave financially destitute and even toyed with the idea of magnanimously offering to return to him, on her terms, of course. A month later, Laura entered the courtroom brimming with confidence, only to be greeted by her visibly anxious lawyer. He pointed discreetly toward a woman seated in the gallery. "She works for Dave," he whispered. Laura's confidence faltered as she noticed the meticulous preparations that had been made on Dave's behalf. At the settlement meeting later that afternoon, Laura was prepared to hand over the title deeds to the family home. However, she was caught off guard when the buyers arrived, not strangers, but Dave himself, accompanied by trucks and a crane carrying her old house. It was only then she realized Dave had bought back their property, ensuring it would remain in the family. Stunned and humiliated, Laura left without a word. Back at her apartment, she stared at the meager check that represented what remained of her once prosperous life. The reality of her situation hit hard. The home she had lost, the trust of her children, and her former life were now out of reach. Picking up her phone, she thought of calling someone, anyone, but instead set it down and sat in silence, overwhelmed by the wreckage of her choices. A few days later, Laura decided to take a step toward reconciliation. She arrived at Sarah's home, clutching a bottle of champagne as a peace offering. When Sarah opened the door, she hesitated but stepped aside to let her mother in. Inside, Laura saw the dining table set for a family dinner. Dave and the boys were arranging dishes, their laughter filling the room with warmth. The scene made Laura feel like an outsider intruding on something she no longer belonged to. She handed the champagne to Sarah, who raised an eyebrow but accepted it without comment. Dave looked up and met Laura's gaze, his expression calm. There was no malice in his eyes, but there was also no warmth, just a distant politeness. "Laura," he said simply, nodding in acknowledgement. I wanted to stop by," Laura began hesitantly. "I don't expect everything to go back to how it was. I just want the chance to show you that I'm trying to be better." Dave's response was measured. "I'm glad you're reflecting, but trust is the foundation of any relationship. And ours was broken. It'll take time and consistent effort to rebuild, if that's even possible." "I understand," Laura said softly. "I'm not asking for anything today. I just wanted to apologize and let you know I'm taking steps to change." Interactions between Laura and her family remained infrequent but civil. Slowly, glimmers of warmth began to reappear. At Sarah's suggestion, Laura began writing letters to her children, sharing memories and personal reflections without expecting replies. One day, to her surprise, she received a short but hopeful response from Larry: "Thanks for your letter, Mom. I'm not ready to talk yet, but I'm glad you're trying." That single sentence was enough to reignite Laura's resolve. She knew it would be a long road, but for the first time in a while, she felt a glimmer of hope.